Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hello again. Today's topic is one that's really near and dear to my heart, which is water. There's been a lot of people in the industry and in my consulting history that have added a lot to soil fertility, and Dr. Albrecht, Neil Kinsey, a lot of people on microbiology, a lot of people on a lot of different segments. But the one thing that I've kind of focused in on, in addition to all those, which are very, very important, obviously, but is water and the effect not only of water on your crop and being able to nourish, but also the right amount of water with the proper soil structure so that it is utilized properly, and also the quality of the water. So we're going to probably have two segments here. The first one, we're just going to talk about water in general for both crop and soil health, and then we'll get back to water quality and what I mean by water quality and what you have to do sometimes to improve your water quality, or why water quality can be managed depending on rainfall and effects of rainfall. So with that preface, I will start with, and this is why I will tell you, it's real basic stuff that you start with. The number one input to successful production of whatever you're growing is water. And the number one management tool that you must be very, very good at, more than anything else, is water management. Too little or too much water, either one will have detrimental effects on not only crop yield, plant health, the whole gamut, if you don't understand how to utilize and manage. So when you look at water, and one of the things, we look at, and I'm big on testing. I think you probably, if you've listened to several of the podcasts, you'll know you can't manage what you can't measure. And because of that, you need to make sure that you know what's in your water, okay? And there's some similarities between water and soil, meaning the majority of the cations that you have in water are the same ones that make up the majority of those held on the CEC, which is calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. But when you look on the other side, when we normally are looking at anions, the negatively charged ions, we might look at nitrate and chloride and sulfate. Those would be nutrients that we kind of deal with on the soil colloid, or as nutrients that aren't bound on the soil colloid. It's a better way to put it. But then we have things that are compound. Those nutrients, the sulfate, chloride, those and nitrate are basically, some of that's utilized by the plant, and all three of those are the plant available form. But then on the other side, we have some compounds. And what's a compound? Well, the difference between an element and a compound is compound has multiple elements bound together, and that's why they're called compounds. So they can be altered or changed. Once any nutrient or any element is in its basic form, like just, calcium, that's as far as you can reduce it or do anything. But if you combine calcium with another element or another compound, and in the case of, say, calcium, and you're talking about limestone, calcium carbonate, I can change or pull that apart, that negatively charged carbonate from that positively charged calcium, and I can change that. But once I've pulled them apart, at least the calcium side, I really can't alter that again. But the carbonate side is a combination of carbon and oxygen. So I can alter that again and make something different. Like I can acidify that and make carbon dioxide and basically create a gas that will get off and gas off, or it'll also leave a free oxygen. So I can change compounds, but I cannot change elements. It's really important to understand a simple chemistry thing that we look at. We also look at other anions, and boron is kind of that unique one. And when I talked about boron in one of my previous podcast, I talk about it's neither positive nor negative. So it's sort of in between. It's a very leachable, but is also found in water. And I'll talk to you about what that volume of water and how sometimes something that seems very trivial will be something that'll really bite you because it doesn't take much in terms of parts per million to add up to a whole lot. So I talked about the things that are very similar between soil tests and water tests.
Now Bill's going to talk about what's different between a soil test and a water test.
But one of the things that is different and what makes water much easier to analyze is I'm putting all of these into solution. Whereas the soil, I have to extract it. I have to pull it off that exchange capacity. I have to get it acidified so I can pull, say, phosphate away from those calcium and magnesium particles that are bound up in the soil. And I got to take, so I'm pulling that out and extracting it by using reagents and other compounds to basically get those things to be able to measure. The thing about a water analysis, it's already in solution. All I have to do is have the proper machinery to be able to run through my machines and basically identify those. And most of them are like gas chromatographs or something similar. And they are burnt, and the light that they push off tells you exactly how much is there. Not to get too detailed, I'm not an expert on that anyway, but I know enough to know how they measure a lot of these things. So that's what we do when we measure water. It's much easier to measure. And so it allows you to have, really the only thing you want is somebody that gives you that consistent result. I can take the same water in and it'll give me the same response back. A lot of people, we talked about a while back, we talked about, healthy soils or soil quality or whatever.
Now Bill's going to talk about the quality of water and why it's so important.
A lot of people talk about the quality of water. What determines water quality? And a lot of times it's how much mineral content is in that water. And that's the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. It's overwhelmingly, that's the majority of them. But also, what are they bound to? Are they bound to bicarbonates? Are they bound to carbonates? Are they bound to nitrates or sulfates or chlorides? It makes a huge difference on the anion side as to what those corresponding cations are held to. And why is that? Well, a carbonate molecule is when it attaches itself to a magnesium or a calcium, it's very, very insoluble. And it's very difficult without a strong acid to take that compound that you've formed, calcium and carbonate, and put them together and be able to free that up and release the calcium, release the carbonate in the form of carbon dioxide and oxygen so that you can actually make that available. And if you're not careful, that carbonate will begin to bind other free calcium in your soil. So we'll talk a little more about what things do to you when you're irrigating, but I'm wanting you to know it's what's in those anions, those negatively charged materials. The thing when you think about water, for every positive, there's a negative. Just like the soil, there is no static charge, like if you touch the water, you get shocked because you got free ions that basically can electrify and give you that charge out. But they're always in balance. You touch your water and it basically is neutral, much the same as you touch your soil and it's neutral. And we have the same thing. Every positive's got a negative. So when you're looking at a good water test, you can say, here's my anions, there's my cations, they balance, they make perfect sense to me, and they go on.
Now Bill's going to talk a little bit about the pH of your water.
Other things that people will look at will say that I'm looking at the pH. And pH is not inherently by itself as important as what it will do over time. We've talked a lot about what the weight of soil is in our aerobic zone. Our top 6 to 7 inches of soil weighs about 2 million pounds. But if you're irrigating with something like 3 acre-feet of water, you're using about 1 million gallons, a little less, but we'll just say you use a little over 3 acre-feet, so you're using 1 million gallons. It weighs roughly 8 pounds per gallon. It weighs just slightly more, but we'll just use 8. So 8 pounds per gallon on 1 million gallons is 8 million pounds. So 4 times the volume of your aerobic zone is the volume of water that you're putting in through there through an irrigation season. And that doesn't make any difference if it's rainfall or applied irrigation. It's the same thing. You've put water onto that soil at this level. So whatever's in that water is going to be added to that soil. And that's why pH becomes so important in one regard. Whatever the pH of that soil is, just because of the sheer volume of it, is usually very close to what the pH of your soil will be. So if you've got a 7.8 pH in your water, miraculously, particularly in dry situations, your soil is going to be probably between 7.7 and 7.9. It's going to be real close to what the water is that you're putting on it. A good friend of mine used to say, the soil will become what your water is. So whatever's in that water will eventually be attached to that soil, and it will build up in it.
Now Bill's going to talk about a few other things that you should look out for in your water.
The other thing we look at, too, is we look at how heavily, what I like to use the word, how heavily loaded, how much of the material that's in there is in that. In a water test, they'll call it total dissolved solids. So basically those are not liquid, they're solids obviously, and it's how much do I have. And the reason that's important is with that much dissolved solid, you have a tendency to form compounds in your water, particularly if you're starting to put maybe fertilizer products or you're starting to put it onto the soil. You're going to get some things tied up just because of the sheer number of those dissolved solids that are in your water. So that's a very big important. Another critical item when determining water quality is what's the EC, or the electroconductivity. Because those that are higher ECs can have a detrimental on plant, particularly root health, because they have a charge that allows an overstimulation to get more than you should get into the plants through the roots. And you can literally electrocute roots and burn them from having this super high electroconductivity. I have seen it even a few cases where it gets super low and you have really poor conductivity, so you have a hard time getting any movement into the soil, that charge differential that we look at. There's so many things to consider that I try to limit how much we want to put in any one episode. And so today we'll talk just in some generalities of water. And one of the things about irrigation water, it's different from place to place, from well to well, from where your rainfall is, from what location of the world you're in. That always is different. So we almost never encounter perfect irrigation water. People consider rainfall as like perfect irrigation water. One of the things about that is normally, and you will see some differences here and there, but primarily, generally, almost always, it will be an acid rain. It'll have acidity to it. And that's important that you know that, because as it hits soil, in the volume that it does, it can be a lot of pounds. If you got 12 inches of rain, you've got 337,000 gallons of water in that per acre. And so you're putting almost the volume of the soil on there. So you can have a direct effect on a lot of acidity created there on your soil surface. And that in turn can be very good for high pH soils, because all of a sudden you get a temporary acidity and it releases a lot of things that are bound up in the soil. It gives you a better place for micronutrients to be taken up in. Almost all of them like to be taken up on the acid side. So if you can get that temporary acidity from the rainfall before your irrigation water will basically bring it back up and be more basic, you will get a response. That's why a lot of times if you'll look at grass, because it's shallow rooted, it gets a huge green up because of the acidity that puts in that first bit of soil that it gets into the top, that those grasses can pick up. And it's both the micronutrients, it can be iron, it can be manganese, it can be all of the things that's struggling to pick up, and immediately it gets them released. And because it doesn't need very much to have a big effect on it, and you don't have a very big plant, it doesn't have far to move those nutrients, you can get significant visual effects just from a good soaking rain. But when I say very rarely do we encounter perfect irrigation water, you can, I guess I've seen things that are very, very close, but never like absolutely perfect, but really excellent waters. But almost all irrigation water can be improved. And some water sources can be so bad that if you use it without some kind of modification, it will not be suitable for sustained crop production. And a lot of times, most labs treat your nutrient management like you're using rainfall, or you're like using distilled water or pure water. And they really haven't developed a program for what these irrigation waters do to your nutrient management. So it's really important to understand where what is in that water will be what your soil becomes. And it will tie up things. We'll talk about probably next time about bicarbonates, carbonates, and those things that will tie up nutrients. But we're going to just do a general topic today about water and what water is and what water isn't. And so why do we need what I like to term as high-performance irrigation water? Because without an adequate supply of high-quality irrigation water, your crop can never achieve its yield potential. And no matter what, if you have everything else perfect, if you do not have an adequate supply of water that is able to deliver nutrient to the plant and not tying up parts of them or not ruining pore space and knocking out oxygen, so you're not getting good mineralization from your micronutrients, all those things, you're always going to have a yield drag, okay? All your farming inputs, all the money you're investing into that seed and nutrients and crop, everything you've put into it, permanent crops, all the money you've put into that are going to be diminished by using poor quality irrigation water if you don't know how to manage. High performance irrigation water will allow you to get the most out of your inputs, the most out of your soil, and the most crop for the least amount of money. Because irrigation water quality really matters. Because normally when you're putting on an irrigation water, it's almost always either taking something with it or leaving something behind. Anybody that's ever had high sodic water or high sodium or sodium chloride waters that have a really high EC, they are burning roots, but they also are depositing pure salts. You know, I think everyone, if they've ever farmed for very much and had any kind of row crop and they have much of a sodium problem, they will irrigate, and as it dries out, they will see that sodium go to the edges of the berms or the furrows or to the higher spots. And then as soon as it gets wet, it'll dissolve it and it'll go back. So it's always, like I say, always leaving something behind. Because the soil, like I said earlier, they tend to take on the chemistry of the irrigation water being applied over time. The soil will become more and more like the irrigation water unless there's some altering of the irrigation water, or you're fortunate enough to get enough rainfall naturally to basically dissolve a lot of these compounds that are higher pH and tying up calcium with bicarbonates and carbonates, and being able to dissolve them and release them back. So it's almost like you build them up and the rain takes them out, and then your irrigation water builds them up and your rain takes it out. I've told people for years, once I got involved with water, that you really cannot have an effective nutrient managed program without taking water quality into account. You know, and so we cannot exist without water. And that's for our crop, for the microbiology, for ourselves, and for any life that exists out there. Water is necessary. So we have to be judicious in how we handle it and how we use it so that we can maximize production by understanding what we can and cannot do with water. Just because of the pure volume of water, I always like to say, you know, it doesn't seem like much, but parts per million add up, because millions of pounds adds lots of parts, lots of pounds. And I had a friend of mine, and still a good friend of mine, that works down in New Zealand, and he's having a lot of difficulty getting soils balanced, and we started talking about his water. And I asked him what if he had taken a sample of his rainwater. And he said, well, why would I do that? It's pure, it should be fine. I said, well, you'd be surprised what you find in it. So he did take one, and he, you know, New Zealand's down on close to the South Pole in a lot of ways. It's very, you know, one of the closer countries to there. So one of the things about our climate, some things move and they deposit, they get closer and closer, and they deposit themselves into the atmosphere at each end of the globe down at the poles. Well, his water pH was somewhere around 5.8. Now that in itself isn't the end of the world, and it wasn't for him either once we understood how to how to apply lime to take care of what this water was doing. Yeah, it was 5.8, but he was getting somewhere in the neighborhood of what he said 2 meters of rain per year, which basically it's about almost a 3.5 foot per meter. So we're looking at almost 7 feet, 72 inches of rainfall in a year at a soil pH of 5.8. And if you look at that much acidity, there's almost, depending on how your exchange capacity, if it's a real heavy soil, you might be able to manage it a little easier. But if it's kind of mildly light or sandy, there's no way you can hold any calcium into the soil. So to do that, we have to apply more often and more than the soil actually looks like it's being required to actually put the balance. Because some of it you're going to lose to leaching from that acidic water. And, I always like to say of anything, if you're looking at water, 100 parts per million, which doesn't sound like a whole lot. There's a million and it's only 100. That's a very small portion of that, okay? But in irrigation water, that'll add up to 270 pounds per acre foot. So every time I put on 12 inches of irrigation water, whatever that is, it's 270 pounds of that material. A good example would be sodium, which we would think, gosh, I'm putting on an application of fertilizer. I'm putting on 270 pounds of pure sodium. So you would think that, and now if you do that year after year after year, you can understand why your soils become so sodic. If you are in a low rainfall area, why they just get worse and worse, And even other things like some of the things I talked about earlier that could be in there, bicarbonate, and you get to a level of, 180 parts per million. Well, that means that you would deliver about 400, almost 500 pounds, 486 pounds of bicarbonate per acre foot. Well, that by itself may not sound like a lot, but if you took, a fairly good high value crop and put 2.5 acre feet on, somewhere around, 29 inches of water, you would deliver 1,200 pounds of bicarbonate per acre of your soil. Think about that, 1,200 pounds. And the reason that's so detrimental is that each pound of bicarbonate that you put on your soil will tie up 1 pound of soluble calcium. So that means if there's average limestone holds about 600 pounds of calcium per ton, the bicarbonate alone is tying up 2 tons of calcium ion in your soil every year. And therefore, you wonder why I can't get my calcium up in those mid to high 60s, and every time I seem to get closer, I fall back. It's because the water's not allowing you to get that. And so a lot of cases, based on a lot of calculations I put together over the years, you have to over-apply calcium to be able to hold enough to stay in the proper amounts to keep your soil structure where you want to. On the other side of the coin, in these loaded waters, you got things like what I call pure water, which means they have very little mineralization. And one of the things about water, it wants to mineralize. It wants to go and add nutrients to it. So a very hungry water, which I'll classify it as that, wants to combine with other things. So when you put pure water or close to pure water on soil, it's trying to gobble up things that will mineralize it. But in the meantime, it has very little charge. It has very little what I call infiltration, which is sideways movement. Almost all your water is just going to go vertically. It's going to go straight down through the soil. And as it does, it will strip and mine out normally calcium, sadly enough, but it can mine out other cations as it mineralizes itself going down. If it's a pure water and it's hungry like that, it's probably acidic, so it's going to release calcium, magnesium, potassium, and pull it with it as it goes through. And then as it gets down a little deeper, it'll begin to, as it mineralizes, begin to infiltrate out. But on the surface, it's almost like it's going straight down vertically. We like to think, and this in a lot of California where I'm from, and even maybe in a lot of the areas of people that are listening to this, the snowmelt water is a really good source of a lot of irrigation water. And one of the problems with snowmelt water is it is too pure. And It has a low EC, so it's not doesn't have a lot of electroconductivity. It doesn't move sideways, which is a lot of the reasons when I said this pure water goes straight down. Well, it's got a very, very low EC, and so therefore it doesn't have that electroconductivity. It's going to move sideways to attach to cations. It's going to take a while to do that. Instead, we want to do it from the time it hits the surface to infiltrate and go sideways. So what happens, of course, that snowmelt water seems to always leach out calcium first. And we're always usually trying to get calcium back into our soils because one, crops are using it and utilizing it, and the other part is it seems to be the thing that keeps our porosity up, which is what we're really looking to do to get that good soil structure. And when the calcium is stripped out, something's going to take place on that soil colloid. And normally, sadly enough, it's usually magnesium. But if you've got a lot of sodium in your water, sodium will become dominant, and then we will have a lot of problems with disbursement of your soil. It'll seal up. Soil doesn't want to take water. Everything suffers. So irrigation water can literally, if you're not careful, strip your soil clean of those things we're trying to build up in forms of calcium. And it could be magnesium or it could be potassium, but it'll strip them out as it's moving through. I always like to talk about the way that plants receive their water and nutrient, because they don't chew their food, they don't chew their nutrient, they absorb them through the roots in the soil solution. And so that's why we're working on this structure issue all the time. You'll get tired of me talking about soil structure, but it is so important because when we have the proper air-water balance, we allow those roots and nutrients to move with the water in that soil solution. And irrigation water is the medium that must deliver the nutrients to the plant. We'll have a lot of microbiology that's working, mineralizing nutrients, but if we don't have water to carry it to the roots and water for the microbiology to thrive in also, we're not going to be successful in our fertility or nutrient management program, because then we get back to that irrigation water quality again has a direct influence on nutrient availability. It's going to make some of the things you're fertilizing with less available because you have too many dissolved solids that's interfering with the actual normal mineralization and deliver those nutrients to the plant. And sometimes I know people, if you've been farming long enough, or even if you're gardening and you look out there and you get some of your water you're using, whether it's out of your faucet or whether it's out of your irrigation well, you'll look at that, and if you pour it into a glass, you'll look at it and it's almost cloudy, okay? And it's not transparent. It's basically opaque to a certain point. And what happens is after a while, if you watch, that'll usually settle to the bottom, and then you'll look through it and it'll be clear on top. But if you take it and swirl it, all of that minerals that have fallen to the bottom will be back in there, and you'll get that cloudiness again, and eventually gravity will take over and it'll put it down onto the bottom. And that's because the water can only carry so much. There's a holding capacity to water. It can only carry so many solids in it in a dissolved state, and it changes for every mineral or every nutrient. And if you want to see what you can get into water, take some distilled water and start with a salt shake and put the salt in and start to, and if you want, you can measure it. I'm going to put, 8 ounces of water, and I'm going to put in half a teaspoon of salt. And I spin it around, and all of a sudden I look, and it's clear, and I wait, and it stays clear. Okay, I've held all of that sodium chloride or that salt in my water. It's in there, it's dissolved, and it's staying dissolved because the water can carry it. It can hold that much in suspension, okay? Then if I keep adding, and pretty soon it gets harder and harder and more agitation to try to get in. Pretty soon what happens is it starts to get cloudy, and then it starts to drop to the bottom. You have now reached what we call the saturation point, which means it cannot hold any more of what you're trying to put in there. Certain elements take less. Salt may be able to put quite a bit more in, or maybe something like sugar. Anybody that's put sugar into tea will notice it normally will drop to the bottom, but you can get a certain amount. If you keep putting enough sugar in there, eventually it'll all drop to the bottom too. So what you're doing is basically, once you reach the saturation point, you're not going to put any more actually in suspension into your water that's held so it's nice and clear. You're going to have something that's cloudy or opaque. Same thing happens to your irrigation water. There's a point where the irrigation water is your well's pulling it up, or it's coming out of your pivots, or it's coming out in your siphon pipe, wherever your water is. It can only carry so much. So we talk about how much your water can hold. And some irrigation water is so heavily laden with the various salts that it can pick up, salts of calcium and magnesium and sodium and potassium, that it does not readily dissolve the salts we want it to convey to the plant root system. So as we irrigate, that water creates our soil solution. But if our irrigation water is so heavily laden with these salts, we may not be able to get those salts of calcium that are held on exchange or held in the soil itself. Instead, what we do is only deliver what's in the irrigation water. And if it's not what we want, then we can have some really detrimental effects. Obviously, it's really simple. Everybody knows it's farming. The too much sodium, you're going to see sodium burn. It's not good for plants. Plants need sodium at a certain level, but too much it has a real detrimental, and it's easy to see if you dig up roots or if you look at the leaf and tissue samples as they begin to burn on the margins and start to burn towards the center and basically get phytotoxic reactions from having too much sodium. Irrigation water that is heavily loaded is going to deposit those extra salts that are in there onto your soil. Are the salts we want in that water, are they ones we want, or do we want to leach them through? Because what level are they, and how much are they adding, and how much rainfall do I get? And we won't have an answer unless we measure things like rainfall. We know what's in our rainfall and what effect it'll have on this. And we really need to know our water chemistry and knowing, are they carbonates, bicarbonates? So I've talked a lot about water, and this is probably a good time to break on volume 1 of explaining a lot about water and hopefully getting through a very, very critical point. We all know we need water. I just want to emphasize just how essential it is to anything you want to do in farming or any kind of success you'll have, is not only understanding the need for water, but also what water will and won't do to your soil and how it can be detrimental as well as positive. So I'm going to break until our next episode. I hope you look forward to it as I describe more of the effects and points of water that I think are really important for you to understand. Thanks again. See you next time.
Thank you for another fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone enjoyed what you had to say about water, specifically rainwater and irrigation water. Make sure to stay tuned for future episodes and leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And always make sure to stay curious.